It was always quiet in the guest room. Eleanor Grace Monroe knew the stillness better than she knew her own voice. The walls were the color of pressed linen, the kind you only touched during Sunday dinners. Her bedspread never had wrinkles, not because she smoothed it with care, but because she rarely slept in it long enough to leave a mark. The Monroe house, white-columned, moss-draped, a Savannah landmark, was the kind of home people drove by and wondered about. Eleanor lived in it, but no one ever wondered about her. Most mornings she woke before the rest of the house. Not out of obligation, but habit. She would dress in silence, step into the hallway and pass by family portraits where her face never appeared. There was Margaret's sorority photo from college, a smiling shot of the twins in matching Easter dresses, and Sam, the only person who ever made her feel like she belonged. He stood in one frame beside a polished wooden boat, grinning like he'd caught more than just a fish. He'd caught peace. That was before he passed. Before the silence deepened. "Morning, sugar," Evelyn called out from across the fence one day, waving with one gloved hand, the other buried in garden soil. She was one of the only people in the neighborhood who used Elena's name. "Morning, Miss Evelyn," Elena replied with a soft smile. "You okay?" Elena hesitated. "Just tired." "Long week." Evelyn nodded slowly, reading more than Elena said. Sometimes tired means more than one thing. Elena nodded back, her throat tightening slightly. She kept walking. Inside, the air carried the sharp scent of lemon polish and magnolia. Margaret insisted on keeping the place spotless, not out of love for cleanliness, but pride. The Monroe house was a symbol, a living testament to legacy, even if Elena herself had no place in it beyond the margins. She wasn't on the family Christmas cards. Her name wasn't engraved in the set of silver spoons passed down from Margaret's mother. Yet when the Monroes had first taken her in, things had felt different. She remembered the day vividly, a soft April rain, the kind that makes the sidewalk steam. Elena had arrived with a social worker and a second-hand suitcase. Margaret had greeted them with polite distance. Sam, however, had smiled like the sun had followed her through the door. "You're safe now, sweetheart," he'd said, placing a hand on her shoulder gently. "This is your home." It was the first time in months anyone had called her that, sweetheart. Home. She was 12. That first week, Sam taught her how to help in the garden, where the good shears were kept, how to pull weeds without damaging the roots. "Everything's got a root, even people," he'd said. "You just got to protect it long enough for it to grow." Elena had carried those words like armor. She still did. Now, at 23, she walked the same hallways with different eyes. The house felt larger somehow, emptier, despite always being full. Heather and Lila, Margaret's biological daughters, had grown into picture-perfect Southern belles, pearls, pastel skirts, sweet tea smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. They were polite to guests, passive to Elena. She wasn't their enemy. She simply didn't exist. "Elena, can you help with the linens?" Margaret called from the second floor. "Of course," Elena replied, already halfway up the stairs. She reached the hall closet and began pulling down sheets, crisp, lavender-scented, folded just so. Her fingers moved automatically. She was good at disappearing into usefulness. "Eleanor?" Margaret appeared at the end of the hall, arms crossed. "Yes, ma'am?" "We'll be hosting the Bakers this weekend. Heather says their son is back in town. I expect the house in order." "Yes, ma'am." Margaret hesitated, then added with a faint smile, "You always did have an eye for making things feel right." It wasn't affection, it was delegation. But Elena accepted it anyway. Later that evening, she sat on the back steps with a cup of chamomile tea, watching the sky change colors. She often found herself here, in the quiet. The yard was manicured, the trees trimmed, the garden maintained. But in the far back corner, by the old pecan tree, wild violets grew unchecked. Sam had let her plant them once. Margaret had threatened to pull them out every year since. She heard gravel crunch beyond the gate. Turning, she saw a man with a canvas bag over his shoulder and work boots dusted in red clay. He looked about her age, with tired eyes and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor that morning. "Evening," he said, tipping his cap. Eleanor blinked. "Can I help you?" He smiled slightly. "Just finished a repair over at the Mitchells. Saw your garden. Those violets are wild. Rare to see someone let 'em bloom like that." She smiled without thinking. "They were planted a long time ago. I guess they're stubborn." "Good kind of stubborn," he replied, adjusting his bag. "Name's Calvin." "Elena." "Nice to meet you, Elena." He gave a small nod. "Keep growing those violets." She watched him walk away, wondering why her heart suddenly felt like it had shifted in her chest. The next day she passed him again at the farmer's market. He was helping an older vendor lift crates of peaches into a truck. "You stalking me?" he teased lightly as she approached. "I could ask you the same." They shared a laugh, small, unpracticed, but real. "You live up on Mercer?" he asked, referencing the Monroe house. "Yes, with the Monroes." He raised an eyebrow but didn't press. "I work odd jobs around town." "Little bit of everything. Do you like it?" He paused. "I like earning my own peace. That's enough." She nodded. "That sounds nice." For the first time in weeks, she felt seen, not evaluated, not categorized. Just seen. By the end of the week, Margaret had noticed. "I saw you chatting with that handyman," she said during dinner, her tone cool. "His name's Calvin," Eleanor replied, sipping water. Margaret set her fork down. "We don't know much about him." "I'd advise caution." Eleanor met her eyes, calm. "Thank you. I'll be careful." In truth, she wasn't sure what she was doing. But she knew what it felt like to have someone speak to her like she mattered. That was rare. That was sacred. That night, she opened the old box of letters she'd kept hidden under her bed. Most were addressed to Sam. Some were prayers. Others were just questions she never asked aloud. She pulled out a fresh page and wrote, "Dear Sam, I met someone today. Not someone who can fix things, but someone who might understand what it feels like to be broken without showing it. I don't know what'll come of it, but tonight, I felt like I wasn't invisible, and that felt like something." She folded the paper gently and placed it on the pile. Then she turned off the light and let the quiet fill the room again. Only this time, it didn't feel quite so lonely. If you enjoyed this video, comment 1 to let me know. If not, comment 2. Your thought mattered to me either way. Elena hadn't intended to see Calvin again, but small towns like Savannah had a way of folding people back into your path. Especially when you weren't sure if you were looking for them, or hoping they'd find you first. It was Thursday afternoon, the sun hanging heavy above the old brick sidewalk on Bull Street. Elena was running errands for Margaret, flowers for the dining table, a specialty cake from Pettigrew's Bakery, and fresh preserves from the farmer's co-op. Margaret was hosting a small luncheon that weekend, and everything had to look effortless. Elena stepped into the bakery first. The bell above the door chimed, soft and familiar. She scanned the display: peach bourbon cake, lavender shortbread, lemon curd tartlets, before the smell of cinnamon and brown sugar wrapped around her like a hug she hadn't asked for but needed. Back again, said a voice behind the counter. Elena looked up. Maya, the owner's daughter, was wiping her hands on her apron. She grinned, warm and easy. "Don't tell me. Margaret Monroe wants it to be just right." "You know her," Eleanor said, amused. "Hard not to," Maya replied, boxing up the cake. "Everything she does is for presentation. Even her compliments sound like instructions." Eleanor laughed under her breath. "You're not wrong. Want to sit a minute?" Maya gestured toward the small cafe table by the window. "You look like you've been walking around with someone else's burdens again." "I can't stay long." 5 minutes won't unravel her empire," Maya said, already pouring 2 glasses of sweet tea. Elena sat, reluctantly at first, then gratefully. "Any news from the palace?" Maya teased gently. "Eleanor." A familiar voice cut in from the doorway. She turned, startled. Calvin stood in the entrance, framed by sunlight and the scent of fresh bread. He held a bag of garden tools in one hand and a paper sack in the other. "I thought that was you," he said, walking in. "I didn't expect to see you here," Eleanor admitted. He smiled, setting the sack on the counter. "I promised Miss Emma I'd fix the shelving in her pantry. She insisted I take her bread pudding as payment." Maya chuckled. "She pays in pudding and opinions." "Both carry weight," Calvin said with a wink. Elena's fingers curled around her glass. "You know everyone in town, don't you?" "Not everyone," he said, looking at her a little too long. "But I'm trying." Something in the air shifted. Maya gave a polite cough. "I'll let you two catch up. Elena, your cake will be ready in 10. Elena nodded, her heart suddenly aware of its own rhythm. Calvin sat across from her, hands resting loosely on the table. "You seem quieter than usual." "You've met me twice," she replied, teasing. "I remember the quiet. It wasn't this quiet." She smiled faintly, brushing a crumb from the table. "It's been a long week." He nodded, sensing more than she said. "I'm sorry." They sat in silence for a beat, comfortable, almost. Then he asked, "Do you ever get tired of pretending everything's fine?" Her breath caught, not because it was too much, but because it was too true. "All the time," she said softly. He leaned back, thoughtful. "You ever wonder what you'd say if no one could hear you but the wind?" "I'd probably whisper too much out of habit," she said, a little surprised by her own honesty. Calvin chuckled. "Then I'd build you a porch where the wind listens better." Something about that line stayed with her. Later that evening, Eleanor returned home to the hum of Margaret's voice, drifting from the sitting room. Heather and Lila were perched on the velvet sofa, their phones glowing in their hands. "Eleanor?" Margaret called. "Come here, dear." Eleanor stepped inside, placing the cake gently on the table. "Perfect," Margaret said, nodding. "Pettigrew's never disappoints." Heather barely glanced up. "Trevor says the Crawfords are hosting a garden party next month. Big guest list. Probably even some state reps." "Good," Margaret said. "Networking is key." "Eleanor, you should come," Lila offered, her tone vaguely amused. "They always need someone to help pour the tea." The comment hung in the air, too polite to be cruel, too pointed to ignore. Margaret pretended not to hear it. Elena smiled faintly. "I'll keep my schedule open." She turned to leave, but Margaret stopped her. "Before you go, about the Bakers. I've invited their son, Thomas, for brunch. He's recently moved back, and I thought perhaps you two could talk." Eleanor froze. "Talk?" "Yes," Margaret said, sipping her tea. "You're not a child anymore. It's time you think seriously about your future. A good match can provide stability. Is that what you think I need?" "It's what everyone needs," Margaret said, Her voice clipped. Especially you. Eleanor nodded slowly. Of course. She walked upstairs in silence, her chest tight. Later, she sat on the edge of her bed, the moonlight tracing soft silver patterns across her comforter. She opened her notebook and wrote, Sam. They want to place me like a vase on a table. Elegant, silent, breakable. I'm starting to wonder if it's better to be wildflowers than porcelain. Calvin said the wind would listen better from a porch. I believe him. She closed the notebook and placed it gently in her drawer. Outside, the violets stirred under the wind, and in her chest, something fragile began to bloom. The sun was already leaning low behind the tall pines when Elena stepped through the iron gate of the Monroe property and onto the worn sidewalk. Her heels clicked softly against the bricks, but inside, her pulse thundered. She wasn't sure if it was the evening air making her light-headed or the note folded in her pocket. 6:30. The Marina. If you're curious. Calvin. He had passed it to her at the market earlier that day, tucked between a bundle of rosemary and sweet corn, like a secret. He didn't explain. He didn't have to. Elena clutched the paper tighter as she reached the edge of the bluff. The air smelled like salt and river stone. The breeze lifted her hair gently off her shoulders. She paused at the top of the wooden steps leading down to the docks, her eyes scanning the quiet shoreline. Then she saw him. Calvin stood beside an old fishing boat, its paint faded to a soft gray blue, almost camouflaged against the water. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the river, arms resting on the wooden rail, like he was listening to it breathe. Eleanor took a slow step forward. You found it, he said without turning. I did. He glanced back at her with a half smile. I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't. But you're here, he said. That counts. She joined him at the railing, the wood warm beneath her fingertips. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Just the soft hush of water against the dock, the distant hum of cicadas. Then Calvin exhaled slowly. I come here when I need to think. Or stop thinking. I don't think I've ever had a place like that. He turned toward her, his gaze steady. You should. She looked out across the river, her voice quiet. My life's always belonged to other people. Their schedules, their expectations, their standards. Margaret? Eleanor nodded. She doesn't see you. She sees what she wants me to be. Calvin didn't respond right away. Then he said, That's not the same. No. It's not. He leaned on his elbows. My father used to say, You don't know someone until you've watched them lose something. I think that's why I live simple. Less to lose. You live simple, she repeated, more a question than a statement. He grinned faintly. By choice. What's that like? He looked at her, more serious now. Liberating. Lonely sometimes, but I'd rather be lonely and honest than accepted for pretending. Elena's chest tightened. That sentence sat between them like a mirror. Do you ever think about leaving? She asked softly. Every day. And yet, you're still here. I stay because I choose to, he said. That makes a difference. They stood in silence again, this time closer, the breeze tangling their words and breaths. Finally, Calvin reached into a small canvas bag near his feet and pulled out a glass jar filled with wild violets. Her violets. I passed by the house this morning, he said. These were growing along the fence. Elena looked down at them, throat tightening. You picked them? I'm not good with flowers, he said, but I figured, if someone planted them with care, They shouldn't go unseen. She took the jar carefully. "They're from Sam's garden." "The man in the photo?" "Yes." Her voice caught slightly. "He was the only one who ever called me daughter, even if it wasn't written down." Calvin nodded. "I didn't know him. But I think he'd be proud of the woman who grew from that garden." She looked at him, startled. His eyes didn't flinch. There was no pity there, just truth. Something inside her shifted. Later, when she walked back through the gates of the Monroe home, her steps felt different, like she wasn't walking into a house, but away from a moment she didn't quite understand yet, but couldn't forget. The dining room was already full of laughter. Heather and Lila were seated with Margaret, sipping iced tea in crystal glasses, the kind brought out only for guests or gossip. "Eleanor?" Margaret called. "There you are. I was beginning to wonder." "I went for a walk," Eleanor replied simply, placing the jar of violets in the kitchen before returning. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "In that dress?" Elena didn't answer. Heather leaned back, smirking. "Didn't run into Thomas Baker, did you?" Lila laughed. "He's been asking about the Monroe girl." "I'm sure he meant you," Eleanor said, sitting down with practiced grace. Margaret interjected. "Actually, he was asking about you, Elena." Elena looked up, startled. "He'll be joining us for brunch this Sunday." "I think it's time you met someone with structure, a future." "I wasn't aware I was looking." "Well," Margaret said, setting down her glass, "sometimes we don't know what's best until it's placed in front of us." Elena smiled thinly. "And sometimes what's placed in front of us isn't what we need." The air stiffened. Margaret stood, her voice smooth. "Just be polite, Eleanor. That's all I ask." "I always am." As the conversation shifted to Heather's plans for a charity gala, Eleanor quietly excused herself and stepped out into the garden. The wind was soft tonight, softer than usual. She knelt beside the patch where the violets used to grow. Only a few remained. Margaret had nearly pulled them all years ago, calling them messy, invasive. Eleanor had protected the rest. She traced one of the petals with her finger, her thoughts heavy. Inside, someone turned on the piano. Classical. Controlled. Elena stood and whispered to the violets, "You're still here, and so am I." Then, with a deep breath, she walked back into the house, shoulders back, heart loud. If you enjoyed this video, comment 1 to let me know. If not, comment 2. Your thought mattered to me either way. Sunday morning came dressed in perfection. The Monroe house was glowing. Light filtered through the lace curtains in delicate patterns. The dining table gleamed under polished silver and porcelain teacups. Slices of lemon rested neatly beside crystal glasses. Fresh hydrangeas filled the room with soft perfume. But beneath the surface, the air felt rehearsed. Margaret was orchestrating everything, down to the angle of the napkins. "Elena, please double-check the flatware," she said briskly. "And for heaven's sake, don't serve the croissants cold. Presentation matters." Elena nodded silently. She moved through the motions, smoothing the tablecloth, adjusting the flowers, arranging the jam like it was a declaration of social standing. Heather and Lila swept down the stairs in pastel dresses, their laughter too loud, their heels too intentional. "Thomas is going to be impressed," Heather whispered with a smile, tugging at Lila's sleeve. "I heard he's been working in Charleston, consulting." "Very eligible," Lila smirked. "Well, let's see if Margaret's little plan works." Eleanor caught their words, but let them pass. They were not meant for her, and yet they were always about her. At exactly 11:30, the doorbell rang. Margaret straightened her blouse, pasted on a smile, and opened the front door. Thomas Baker stepped inside, tall, groomed, confident. The kind of man who entered a room as if it owed him something. He wore a cream blazer, his hair parted perfectly, and he carried the kind of handshake that was trained, not born. "Elena?" Margaret called sweetly. "Come say hello." She stepped forward, her navy dress simple but elegant, her expression polite. She extended her hand. "It's nice to meet you." Thomas smiled. "Likewise. I've heard a lot about you." She tilted her head. "I hope that means something good." He chuckled. "Depends who's doing the telling." Margaret led them all to the dining room. Small talk floated like bubbles, safe, shiny, and hollow. Thomas spoke of his career, of his family's second home near Tybee Island, of his travels to Europe. Lila asked about a wine tasting in Atlanta. Heather hung on every word, but Elena watched quietly. She listened. Halfway through brunch, Thomas turned to her. "And what about you, Elena? What are you passionate about?" It was the first real question anyone had asked her in weeks. She looked up, surprised. She's quite the helper," Margaret interrupted smoothly. "Keeps things running around here." Elena set her fork down. "I'm interested in social work. I volunteered at the Women's Center downtown." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Really?" "That's admirable." "It's not glamorous," she said with a soft shrug. "But it matters." Margaret's fork paused mid-air. "Elena, now's not the time to go into all that." "I was asked?" The tension fluttered, barely visible but alive. After brunch, the group moved to the sitting room for tea. Margaret whispered something to Thomas, then stepped back, leaving them alone by the window. He smiled politely. "Your mother? She's not my mother," Elena said gently, not bitter, just true. He blinked. "I see." Elena looked out toward the garden. "This whole setup, it's not really about us getting to know each other, is it?" He hesitated. "No, I suppose not." She turned to him. "Then why did you come?" He studied her, his smile fading into something more honest. "Curiosity. And pressure." "Margaret and my mother are part of the same garden club." Elena gave a quiet laugh. "Of course they are." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You don't seem like someone who fits this mold." She met his eyes. "That's because I don't." They sat in silence for a moment before he added, "Still, you're impressive." "Thank you, but I'm not looking to be rescued." "Neither am I." She gave him a small, grateful nod. "Good." Behind them, Margaret watched from the hallway, her lips tight. That evening, Elena stood on the back porch, sipping a cup of herbal tea. The sky was watercolor pink and gold, soft clouds painting a kind of stillness that felt earned. She heard the gate creak gently. "Figured I'd find you here." She turned. Calvin. He wore a chambray shirt rolled at the sleeves, hands in his pockets, and a smile that didn't ask for attention. It simply deserved it. "How was the royal luncheon?" he asked, stepping up beside her. "Every bit as polished as you'd imagine," she said, "and twice as staged." He chuckled. "Was he charming?" "In the way someone is when they know how much they cost." Calvin nodded slowly. "And you?" I told the truth. "Dangerous," he teased. "Liberating," she corrected. They stood there, quiet. Then she asked, "Have you ever been introduced like a product?" "Only once. Didn't end well. I told the girl I preferred building things over brunches. Her mother said I wasn't ambitious enough." "What did you say?" I told her ambition's not always loud. Sometimes it's just steady. Eleanor turned to him, her voice soft. Thank you. For what? For not being part of all that. He studied her a moment. You ever want to disappear? Sometimes. But lately, I think I just want to be seen. Fully, no conditions. Calvin reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded paper. He handed it to her. She opened it. A simple sketch, a porch with 2 chairs and wild violets at the steps. It's not much, he said. But I started thinking, maybe the wind shouldn't be the only one who gets to listen. Her eyes filled, but no tears fell. Calvin, you don't have to say anything, he added quietly. Just know, when you're ready, there's a seat for you. The sun dipped below the trees, leaving only gold dust in its place. And for the first time in years, Eleanor didn't feel like she was on the outside looking in. She felt like maybe she was being invited in. The first thing Eleanor noticed was the way Margaret stood, arms folded tightly, back stiff, her gaze narrowed on the envelope in her hands. It was late afternoon, and the house was quiet, except for the low ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. The sunlight filtering through the window threw long shadows across the hardwood floors. Something was wrong. Something had shifted. Elena, Margaret called, her voice smooth but tight at the edges. Elena stepped into the sitting room. Yes? Margaret didn't look up. She held the envelope like it had been burning in her fingers for hours. I found this while organizing Sam's old files. Eleanor blinked, unsure. Margaret finally raised her eyes, but they didn't soften. You should know. This changes nothing. Not really. Elena took a hesitant step forward. What is it? Margaret extended the envelope without ceremony. Eleanor opened it carefully. Inside was a single page. Legal. Stark. Her name typed in clean official print at the top. Adoption confirmation. Eleanor Grace. She felt the air change, felt her hands go cold. I always knew, she said quietly. I just didn't have proof. Margaret's lips pressed together. Sam insisted on keeping the paper. I didn't see the point. You were brought in during a time of loss. Mine, not yours. We did what was right. You were given more than most ever get. Elena folded the paper slowly. I was given a roof. You were given a family. Elena looked her dead in the eye. No, I was given an arrangement. The silence that followed wasn't thick. It was hollow. Like an old well with no water left in it. You've had food, shelter, education, Margaret started. I had a role, Eleanor interrupted. You didn't raise a daughter. You raised an accessory, a well-behaved, presentable placeholder. From the stairs, soft footsteps echoed. Heather and Lila entered, clearly having heard enough to pretend they hadn't. Is it true? Lila asked, eyes flickering between Eleanor and Margaret. You're not really one of us? Heather crossed her arms. I always wondered. You don't exactly fit the mold. Eleanor turned to them, her voice calm. No. I don't. I wasn't meant to. Margaret sighed sharply. This changes nothing about your duties here. My duties, Eleanor repeated. Do you hear yourself? You're being dramatic. No, Eleanor said, her voice firm. I'm being honest. For once. She turned and walked out of the room, the document still in her hand. Her heart wasn't racing, but something inside her had gone very, very still. Later that evening, she sat in the garden, the paper beside her on the bench, the violets swaying in the breeze. Calvin arrived just after sunset. No knock, no call. He just knew. He sat next to her in the quiet. She didn't speak, just handed him the paper. He read it silently, then folded it and handed it back. "I already knew you were different," he said softly. "This just proves it. I feel unanchored." He looked at her, steady. "Or maybe free?" She turned to him, the weight of the day softening in her eyes. "That's the thing. I don't know what freedom feels like." Calvin paused. "Then maybe this is where you begin." The wind picked up, brushing through the garden like a sigh. Inside, Margaret poured herself a glass of sherry. Heather stood by the kitchen island, arms folded. "You think she'll leave?" "Not without a plan," Margaret muttered. "And Elena never does anything without a plan." Heather raised a brow. "She's been seeing that handyman." "Calvin," Margaret said, the name tasting unfamiliar. Heather tilted her head. "He's plain, has no family money. Owns a beat-up truck." Margaret didn't respond, but something shifted behind her eyes. "You don't think she's stupid enough to try and marry down, do you?" Margaret set her glass down. "She's impressionable, romantic. She's a Monroe, whether by paper or not," Heather insisted. "No," Margaret said coolly. "She's not, and she never was." The next morning, Eleanor found a note on her dresser. "You'll need to start contributing more to the household. Brunches and laundry won't prepare themselves. M. No greeting." No signature, just a reminder. Eleanor read it twice, then placed it in the drawer beside Sam's photograph. At noon, she walked into town to meet Evelyn for tea. The old woman sat by the window of the Velvet Leaf Cafe, her floral scarf tied loosely around her neck, her eyes bright with age and intuition. "Well, if it isn't my favorite storm cloud," Evelyn said with a smile. Eleanor sat, exhaling slowly. "I think I'm unraveling." Evelyn poured the tea. "No, darling, you're waking up." They talked for an hour, about family, about names, about the difference between being raised and being accepted. "You know," Evelyn said gently, "roots aren't always in the soil. Sometimes they're in the people who water you." Elena blinked back the tears. "I don't want to stay there anymore." "Then don't." "But I have nowhere else to go." Evelyn leaned forward. "Do you?" Eleanor hesitated. "Calvin." That evening, Eleanor stood at the edge of her room, a small suitcase open on the bed. Not packed, just open. The breeze from the window moved the curtain gently, like an invitation. And for the first time, she wondered, not what if she left, but when. The sound of her suitcase zipper breaking the silence was louder than Elena expected. It was still early, just past 6, and the house was asleep. Morning light slipped between the blinds, resting across the carpet like a quiet warning. She hadn't packed much. Just a few dresses, her notebook, and Sam's photo. Not because she didn't have more, but because none of it felt like hers. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the open case, her fingers brushing the folded edge of the photo. Sam's face smiled back at her, warm, proud, like he knew this day would come. She hadn't told Calvin yet. She didn't know how. It wasn't just about leaving, it was about what would come after. And if he'd even want to be a part of that. Her phone buzzed softly. "Calvin, meet me at the garden. You'll want to see this." Eleanor took one last look around her room. The walls too white, the bed too neat, the air too still. She zipped the suitcase shut and left it by the door. The walk to the garden was short but slow. She felt every step, as if the ground beneath her feet was both inviting and resisting her decision all at once. The scent of dew and jasmine clung to the air. Savannah always knew how to make even tension smell like poetry. When she reached the edge of the garden behind Evelyn's house, she froze. Calvin was there. So was Evelyn, and something else. A wooden structure, half-built, framed in warm cedar. It wasn't large, it didn't have windows yet, but it had a foundation. 4 posts and 2 wooden rocking chairs already set out front. "I didn't want to assume," Calvin said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "But I wanted to show you, this isn't just an idea." Elena stepped closer, her voice barely audible. "What is it?" "It's a start," he said. "A home. Not a house, just a place that can be ours, if you want it." Evelyn smiled gently, watching the two of them from a few feet away. "He's been coming here in the mornings before work. Said it helped him think better with wood in his hands." Elena's chest tightened. "Why didn't you tell me?" Calvin shrugged. "I didn't want you to feel pressured. Or like you owed me anything." She walked toward the structure, letting her fingers run along the fresh wood. The grain felt alive, like something breathing, becoming. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Calvin replied, his voice low. "Just know there's a place for you. No expectations, just space." Elena turned, and for the first time in days, her eyes met his without hesitation. "You built this for me?" "I built it for us," he corrected. "But only if us feels right to you." A long breath escaped her lips. "I'm ready," she said. Evelyn clapped once, softly. "Then let's get you packed." Eleanor laughed through the lump in her throat. "I already did." But the moment wasn't meant to last. That afternoon, while Elena packed the last of her things, Margaret arrived home early. She stepped into the entryway, just as Elena descended the stairs, suitcase in hand. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "What's this?" Elena didn't flinch. "I'm leaving." "You're what?" "I'm leaving the house. Today." Margaret took a slow step forward. "You don't just walk out of a family." "You're right," Elena said. "Because I was never really in one." "Elena?" "No," Elena said softly. "Let's not do that thing where we pretend this is something it's not. You made it clear a long time ago. I was temporary, convenient, and now I'm done trying to earn a space you never intended to give me." Margaret's expression shifted, just slightly. "Where will you go?" "I have people, I have someone, and I have peace." "That handyman?" Margaret's voice dipped, just enough to reveal the judgment tucked inside. Eleanor smiled, but there was no sharpness in it, only clarity. "Yes, and he's more honest than anyone I've met under this roof." Margaret's shoulders stiffened, her voice clipped. "You walk out that door, Elena, and you leave behind everything we've given you." Elena's gaze was steady. "What you gave me was shelter. What I needed was love." She turned, pulled the suitcase behind her, and didn't look back. By dusk, she stood on the porch of the half-built home, wind in her hair, Calvin by her side. They watched the sky shift to lavender and gold. "You're sure?" he asked, gently. She nodded. "I'm done being quiet in rooms that refuse to hear me." He pulled a blanket from his truck, laid it across the rocking chairs, and motioned for her to sit. She did. He joined her, their arms close but not touching. Just enough to know they were no longer alone. And in that stillness, under a sky that had never asked her to be more than herself, Eleanor whispered, "I think I've finally arrived." The mornings were different now. Eleanor woke to bird song instead of footsteps down a polished hallway. The scent of sawdust and sun-warmed grass replaced lemon polish. Her room, though unfinished, felt more like home than the one she'd lived in for over a decade. A single window overlooked the marsh, and when she opened it each morning, the breeze carried salt, promise, and the faint sound of Calvin working with his hands. She liked that sound. He was usually outside before sunrise, smoothing concrete, measuring frames, talking to the structure like it had a soul that just needed waking. And maybe it did. One morning, she stepped outside with 2 mugs of coffee, still in her robe, bare feet brushing against the cool wooden planks of the temporary steps. Calvin looked up from where he was laying new flooring inside the front room. "I was going to bring you some," he said, wiping his brow. "I beat you to it," she replied, handing him the mug. He took it and smiled. "You're up early." She sat on the edge of the platform, her legs dangling. "I'm sleeping lighter these days." "Bad dreams?" "No," she said after a pause. "Just new dreams. Ones I don't want to sleep through." Calvin sipped his coffee and joined her, setting his tool belt aside. The morning was still soft, golden with promise. "Do you miss it?" he asked suddenly. "The Monroe house? Everything." She stared out at the marsh. "Sometimes I miss the idea of family. Not what it actually was. I miss Sam's laugh. The way he used to call me Sunbeam when I was too serious. I miss things that made me feel real." Calvin glanced at her gently. "You ever think of going back? To visit? To forgive?" She exhaled slowly. "I don't think I'm ready for that. Maybe one day." He nodded, letting the silence stretch. "When you are, I'll walk you to the door." She looked at him then, the way his profile caught the light, how his eyes were always watching, but never pushing. "You really mean that?" "I do." They sat for a long while, until the coffee cooled and the birds quieted. Later that afternoon, Eleanor walked into town for her first shift at the Velvet Leaf Cafe. Maya had insisted she help out part-time, something light, something social, something Elena could shape on her terms. "Look at you," Maya said, as Elena tied her apron behind the counter. "Who would have thought the Monroe mystery girl would be running lattes with me?" Eleanor laughed. "Careful. I might start smiling too much and ruin my reputation." Maya handed her a menu list. "People are already talking." "About what?" "You. Leaving. Starting over." "Moving in with him." Eleanor glanced out the window toward the street. "It's a small town. People need something to whisper about." "Well, let them whisper," Maya said. "At least now you're writing the story they'll have to tell." The bell above the door chimed. Eleanor looked up, and her breath caught Heather. She walked in wearing oversized sunglasses, a linen blazer, and a purposeful smile. But her eyes betrayed the reason she was there. "Eleanor," she said, removing her glasses slowly. Maya straightened behind the counter. Elena remained calm. "Heather." "I was in the area," Heather said, though it was clear she had taken a long detour. "Thought I'd grab a coffee." "We serve tea now, too," Elena replied, her tone even. Heather hesitated, then stepped closer. "I heard you moved out." Elena offered no reaction. "News travels. So it's true then? You're living with him?" "His name is Calvin." Heather's brows rose. "I remember him from school. Quiet. Bit odd. Always reading blueprints instead of books." Eleanor met her gaze. "Maybe he was building something everyone else was too distracted to see." There was a flicker. of irritation, confusion, maybe envy. Heather placed a hand on the counter. I'm just concerned. You went from a secure life to this. Eleanor leaned forward. You mean from serving meals in a house where I was invisible, to working in a cafe where people call me by my name? Heather flushed. You had a good life. I had a role. There's a difference. Maya stepped in. Would you like that coffee to go? Heather blinked, suddenly remembering where she was. No. I'm fine. She turned to Elena, softening her voice. If you need anything, really, we're still family. Elena studied her, then said gently, Family isn't who lets you stay. It's who wants you to belong. Heather left without another word. That evening, Calvin found Elena sitting on the floor of the nearly finished front room, surrounded by wildflowers in mason jars. You okay? He asked, stepping carefully around the jars. She came to the cafe today, Elena said quietly. He didn't need to ask who. She wanted me to know she was concerned. He sat beside her. How do you feel? Clear, she said. For the first time, I didn't want to prove anything. Calvin smiled. You don't have to. She reached for one of the jars, gently twisting it in the light. I think it's time to plant the rest of the violets. Want help? No, she said. I want to do this one by myself. She stood, kissed his cheek softly, and walked out into the dusk. The earth was warm beneath her knees as she dug the first hole beside the porch. She placed the roots gently, covering them with care. And as the first stars appeared overhead, Elena whispered into the quiet, Grow here, like I finally am. The house was nearly finished. By the end of August, the porch had its rails, the walls their coat of soft sage paint, and the kitchen smelled like cedar and cinnamon, thanks to Evelyn's homemade soap and Elena's afternoon baking. It wasn't grand, but it was honest. The kind of home built by hands that loved more than they explained. Elena stood in the doorway that evening, barefoot, her apron dusted with flour, watching Calvin carry in the last of the kitchen chairs. They wobble a little, he warned, setting one down. I don't mind wobble, she said, brushing her hands against her apron. Means they've been used. Calvin smiled. Everything here has. They both paused, quietly knowing he wasn't just talking about the chairs. You nervous? He asked. A little, she admitted. He walked over and leaned against the doorframe beside her. You've been quiet since yesterday. Margaret left a message. He turned toward her. What kind of message? She's hosting a garden reception. Fundraiser for the Historical Society. Invited me. Calvin's eyebrows lifted. You think it's about charity? Eleanor shook her head slowly. It's never just about that. She wants to see what I've become, or maybe confirm what I haven't. You don't have to go. I know, she said. But part of me wonders if it's time. Not to be accepted, just to show her I don't need it anymore. Calvin studied her for a long moment. Then let me come with you. She looked up. Really? If you're stepping back into their world, I want you to know you're not stepping in alone. She reached for his hand. Thank you. They stood together until the sun dipped past the trees, the porch light flickering on like a small beacon. 2 days later, the Monroe garden was trimmed within an inch of its life. Hedges perfectly clipped, lanterns strung above the magnolias. Waitstaff in white gloves served sweet tea and smoked salmon crostini. Guests wandered the paths with practiced ease, smiling for cameras, praising the hydrangeas, dropping checks into donation baskets like it was performance art. Elena hadn't seen the house since she left. Now, standing at the gate in a simple but elegant linen dress, her heart thudded, not with fear, but memory. Calvin stood beside her in a crisp button-down, calm and steady. "You ready?" he asked. She nodded. "Let's walk in like we belong, even if we never did." The moment they entered, the conversation slowed, just slightly, but enough for Eleanor to feel it. Glances flicked. Smiles tightened. Then, like any good Southern gathering, everyone returned to pretending. Margaret spotted her first, standing under the archway near the koi pond. She wore ivory, her hair in a polished twist, a string of pearls gracing her neck like punctuation. "Elena," she said smoothly, approaching with an air of poised surprise. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "You invited me," Eleanor replied, her voice soft but clear. Margaret's eyes moved to Calvin. "And this is—" "Calvin Brooks," he said, offering a polite nod. "It's good to meet you." Margaret's smile barely shifted. "Of course." Heather and Lila approached next, both wearing smiles that didn't touch their eyes. "Well, well," Lila said. "Didn't think we'd see you here." Heather sipped from her glass. "Word is you've been building something, out near Evelyn's place?" "A home," Eleanor said. "With someone who sees me." Heather's mouth opened, then closed again. Lila looked away, suddenly fascinated by a centerpiece. Margaret cleared her throat. "We're glad you're doing well." Eleanor looked around the garden, at the hedges she used to trim, the glasses she used to wash, the family portraits where her face never appeared. "This is beautiful," she said, "but it never made me feel like I mattered." Margaret's expression hardened just slightly. "You always had a place here." "A place is not the same as a part," Elena replied. "I know that now." Across the garden, Pastor Holt appeared, making his way toward them. "Elena Grace," he said warmly. "It's been too long." "It has," she replied. "And Calvin? Sam used to talk about your father. I believe they fished together once." Calvin nodded. "They did. My dad said Sam was the kind of man who made silence feel full." Pastor Holt smiled. "That sounds like him." Eleanor turned to Margaret. "You kept the house exactly the same." Margaret blinked. "Why wouldn't I?" Eleanor shrugged gently. "Just thought, without me around, things might shift." "They did," Margaret said, her voice cooling. "Things are simpler now." Elena looked down for a moment, then back up. "You taught me something, Margaret." "Oh?" "You taught me how not to treat people." Margaret flinched, but barely. Her lips parted as if to respond, but no words followed. Elena leaned closer. "You once told me I was taken in during a time of loss, that I should be grateful." Margaret's posture stiffened. "I am," Eleanor said. "But not for the reasons you think." She turned to Calvin. "Let's go." They walked past the lanterns and glasses and polite stairs, back through the gate, and into the warm summer evening. At the edge of the driveway, Calvin paused. "You okay?" Eleanor let out a long, quiet breath. "Yes." He offered his hand. She took it. "I didn't go back to be accepted," she said. "I went back to leave for good." And with that, they stepped into the twilight, the sound of clinking glasses fading behind them. Ahead, the road curved toward the marsh, toward home. And for the first time, Elena didn't feel like she was running away. She was walking forward. The next morning came with a different kind of quiet. Not the silence of being overlooked, or the hush of held-in breath, but the stillness, that follows a closed door. Final. Clean. Elena sat at the breakfast table, the window open, the breeze tugging gently at the edge of the curtain. Calvin moved around the kitchen behind her, the scrape of a chair, the clink of ceramic. Everything felt steady. But her thoughts swirled. Did it feel like closure? He asked, placing a bowl of fruit in front of her. She took a slow bite of peach. It felt like something ended. I'm just not sure what's supposed to begin. Calvin sat across from her, folding his hands loosely. You've been carrying their weight for so long. Maybe now you're figuring out how light you actually are. She nodded, then looked up. Do you ever wonder if we got here too fast? Here? He asked gently. This, us, the house, the garden, everything we've built. I didn't know myself when I moved in. I just knew what I wasn't. Calvin leaned back slightly, processing her words. Are you saying you need space? No, she said quickly, her voice softening. I'm saying I want to grow. I just don't know if I'm growing toward you, or next to you. He didn't flinch. That's fair. She reached for his hand. I've never had this before. Someone willing to let me be uncertain without making me feel like I'm failing. You're not failing, Eleanor. You're unfolding. She held his gaze. Are you sure you want to stay for all of it? I didn't build this porch for a moment, he said quietly. I built it for seasons. She blinked fast, the weight of his words landing like warmth in her chest. Then I want to stay. That afternoon, Eleanor went to visit Evelyn. The old woman was on the back porch, shelling peas into a metal bowl, the rhythmic click of each one falling like punctuation. You look like someone who just dropped a stone and watched the ripples, Evelyn said, without looking up. I think I finally stopped waiting for a rescue that was never coming. Evelyn nodded slowly. And how does that feel? Strange. Good. Like, I'm not missing anything anymore. Evelyn patted the chair beside her. Then it's time for what's next. I want to work, Eleanor said, sitting down. Really work. Not just help around the cafe or decorate the porch. I want to build something that matters. You already are, Evelyn said. But tell me what you're thinking. Eleanor hesitated. A foundation. For young women like me. Girls who age out of foster care and fall through the cracks. I want to give them a place to land. Evelyn smiled, her fingers pausing in the bowl. That sounds like home. I want to name it after Sam, Eleanor continued, her voice catching. He was the first person who looked at me and saw more than a file. Evelyn reached for her hand. He'd be honored. Later that evening, Eleanor brought it up to Calvin as they sat on the back steps, watching the moon rise slow and full. A foundation, he repeated. I love it. You don't think it's too much? Too soon? I think it's the first thing you've said all day that made your eyes light up. She looked down, shy. I want it to be real. Then let's start tomorrow. The next week unfolded like pages in a journal. Small steps, handwritten lists, late-night planning sessions with coffee and soft music playing from the record player. Calvin drew sketches for a community space. Evelyn connected them with local leaders, and Maya offered to host a fundraiser at the cafe. But word, as always, traveled fast in Savannah. One morning, Eleanor received a letter. No return address, but the handwriting was familiar. Precise, measured, Margaret. She stood on the porch, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. Eleanor, I heard about the foundation. Your plans. Your intentions. I suppose I should say I'm surprised. But I'm not. You always had a way of turning small things into something significant. I won't pretend to understand your choices, but I will ask this. If you're going to use Sam's name, remember what he stood for. Dignity. Order. Reputation. Don't confuse noise for impact. M. Elena folded the letter slowly and stared out across the yard. Calvin appeared beside her, reading her expression like a second language. Want to talk about it? She handed him the letter. He read it silently, then handed it back. You know that's not who Sam was. I know, she whispered, but it still stings. Calvin looked out toward the horizon. Then build something louder than her memory of him. Make it impossible for anyone to rewrite the truth. Elena smiled, though her chest was tight. Okay. 2 weeks later, they stood in front of the old community center near the river. It was weathered, forgotten, but the bones were strong. The city had approved their proposal. Renovation would begin in the fall. Eleanor stepped inside the empty space and closed her eyes. I can see them, she whispered. Girls who need more than a lecture. Girls who need a safe chair to sit in and someone to say, you matter. Calvin stepped behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders. Then let's build the chairs. And as dust floated in the golden light, and dreams anchored into plans, Elena felt something rise in her. Not just purpose, not just peace, but finally, belonging. The old community center smelled like time. Dust clung to the baseboards. Light spilled in through tall, cracked windows. The floor creaked under every step, like it was waking up after years of forgetting it had purpose. Eleanor stood in the middle of the main room, eyes lifted to the wooden beams above, as if trying to imagine the echo of laughter that hadn't happened yet. This place has a heartbeat, she whispered. Calvin stood beside her, clipboard in hand. It's faint, but it's there. They'd been meeting with volunteers all week, local builders, artists, counselors, and even Maya, who offered to teach budgeting and job skills once things were up and running. There was momentum now. Word had spread. People were curious, some skeptical, but most just moved aside and let Elena lead. It was late afternoon when the door creaked open and Evelyn stepped in, holding 2 paper bags of snacks and tea. I brought reinforcements, she announced. You can't change the world on an empty stomach. Elena walked over and hugged her. Thank you, you didn't have to. I didn't, but I wanted to. That's what matters now, isn't it? They sat together near the window on old folding chairs that would soon be replaced, the sunlight stretching long shadows across the dusty floor. Evelyn looked around. It's strange, isn't it? How life circles back. This building used to be the Sewing Guild meeting hall. My mother taught girls here how to stitch, how to stand straight, how to speak with purpose. Eleanor smiled. You never told me that. Evelyn shrugged. Didn't think I needed to, until now. They sat in the hush of memory for a moment longer. Then Calvin walked over with a fresh sketch. I think we can repurpose this front space into a welcome area. Maybe use reclaimed wood for the desk? Eleanor leaned forward. Yes, and a reading corner by the fireplace. Something warm. You're thinking of Sam, Evelyn said gently. I always am, Eleanor replied. He believed home was where someone saw you and didn't flinch. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, scattering golden leaves against the porch. But the peace didn't last. Later that evening, as Elena walked through the square on her way to the cafe, she spotted Heather sitting at a patio table, legs crossed, phone in hand, a familiar sharpness to her presence. She hadn't seen her since the garden event. Heather looked up. Their eyes met. Neither moved. Finally, Heather stood. "Elena, can we talk?" Elena hesitated but nodded. They walked a few paces to the side, just out of earshot of the cafe crowd. Heather folded her arms. "So, you're turning that rundown place into a... what?" "A charity shelter? It's a transitional foundation," Eleanor replied evenly, "for young women who've aged out of foster care." Heather tilted her head. "And who's funding it?" "Donations from Evelyn's garden club." Eleanor kept her voice steady. "Some from the city, some private. The rest from people who understand what it means to fall between the cracks." Heather's laugh was light but hollow. "You really think you're going to build a legacy from broken beams and goodwill?" "I think I already started." Heather looked away for a moment, her mask slipping just enough. Mother's worried. Eleanor's heart pinched, but not in the way it used to. "Is that why you're here?" "No," Heather admitted, her voice quieter. "I'm here because, for the first time, people aren't asking about us. They're asking about you. About what you're doing, who you're with, how you pulled this off." "I didn't pull it off," Eleanor said softly. "I built it, every piece, with help from people who didn't need me to be someone else." Heather's posture stiffened. "You don't have to throw the whole family away, you know." Elena shook her head. "I didn't throw anything. I let go of what never held me." The silence between them pressed down. Then Heather looked at her, something fragile flickering in her eyes. "Do you ever miss it?" "Missing and mourning aren't the same," Eleanor said. "I mourn the love I wished I had. But I don't miss pretending." Heather nodded slowly, then walked away without another word. Back at home, Eleanor stood in the kitchen stirring a pot of soup. The smell of thyme and sweet onion filled the space. Calvin walked in, kicked off his boots, and leaned against the doorframe. "You okay?" "She came to find me," Elena said, not turning. "Heather?" She nodded. "Do you regret anything?" he asked. Elena looked at the bubbling pot, then finally met his eyes. "I regret not leaving sooner. But not because of the pain, because I let myself believe I needed their permission to start." Calvin stepped behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders. "You didn't." "You don't." They stood there in quiet understanding. Then Elena whispered, "I think I'm ready to open the foundation in Sam's name." Calvin smiled. "Then let's tell the world." That night, she pulled out her notebook, the one filled with letters she'd never sent, and added one more. "Dear Sam, you once told me everything has roots, even people, that all we need is a little soil, a little sun, and someone to believe we can grow. I've found my soil. I've made my sun, and today I believe in me. Thank you for planting the first seed. Love, Eleanor." She closed the notebook, set it beside her bed, and turned off the light. Tomorrow, she would walk into that community center not as someone asking for space, but as someone giving it, and she was finally ready. The ribbon fluttered in the wind like it had something to say. It was tied across the front doors of the newly restored community center, a soft shade of violet, the same color as the flowers that grew along the edge of Elena and Calvin's porch. Dozens of folding chairs were arranged in neat rows outside, and guests filled them with soft chatter, handshakes, and the occasional murmur of surprise when someone mentioned who was behind the whole thing. Elena stood inside the doorway, her fingers brushing the paper she'd folded into her pocket. A short speech, nothing fancy, just honest. The walls around her still smelled like fresh paint and hope. "You okay?" Calvin asked, stepping up beside her. She nodded slowly. Never thought I'd be the one holding the scissors. He smiled. You've been holding more than that for a long time. It's just the first time you're being seen. Elena looked through the window to the crowd. Evelyn was seated in the front row, wide-brimmed hat tilted slightly to block the sun. Maya stood nearby, organizing name tags and handing out printed flyers. Even a few council members showed up, their suits stiff, but their smiles genuine enough. And then, right before she turned to step outside, Elena saw them. Margaret, Heather, Lila. They stood at the back of the gathering crowd, far enough to remain uninvolved, close enough to be noticed. Margaret wore her usual cream blazer, her expression unreadable. Heather's lips were pressed into a neutral line, but Lila looked uncertain, maybe even softened. Elena felt her breath shift, not falter, just sharpen. She turned to Calvin. They came. Do you want to speak to them? She considered that for a moment, then shook her head. Not today. The small podium had been set up beneath the oak tree, its roots stretching out like arms. When Elena stepped up to it, the crowd quieted almost immediately. She glanced at her notes, then folded them again and placed them gently on the surface. I was never supposed to stand here, she began, her voice steady. Not according to the script some people had written for me. I was supposed to stay grateful, stay silent, stay small. She paused, letting the words settle. But I learned something. I learned that silence doesn't keep you safe. It just keeps you invisible. And small isn't humble when it's the only shape you're allowed to be. The audience sat still, listening. This place, she gestured behind her, isn't just a building. It's a beginning. For girls who have nowhere to go. For women who've been told they're too complicated, too emotional, too much. It's a place to land. And a place to launch. A soft murmur of approval ran through the crowd. I named it the Sam Grace Foundation, she continued, voice thickening. Because Sam Monroe was the first person who ever made me feel like I belonged somewhere. And because grace, when it's real, doesn't have terms. She smiled gently, her eyes scanning the faces. Thank you for seeing me, for showing up, for letting this space breathe again. With that, she stepped down and took the ribbon-cutting scissors from Calvin. They cut it together. The applause rose slowly, then swelled, steady, sustained. Elena blinked fast, trying to keep the tears behind her smile. Calvin wrapped an arm around her back as guests began to mingle, entering the building, exploring the newly painted rooms, the welcome signs, the cozy chairs arranged in the reading nook. Elena greeted guests one by one, some from town, some old acquaintances, even a few unfamiliar faces who simply wanted to be part of something that felt good. And then, as the crowd began to thin, Margaret approached. Elena turned, prepared, calm. Margaret offered a faint nod. It's impressive. Thank you. I wasn't sure what to expect. I was. They stood in silence. The distance between them wasn't just physical. It was built from years of unspoken things, from words that were never offered, and truths that were quietly buried. Margaret looked around the main hall. He would have liked this. I built it for people like me, but I think I also built it for him. Margaret hesitated. You've done well, Elena. That means something coming from you, Elena said carefully. Even if it's late. Margaret gave a slow nod, then stepped back. No apology, but no denial either. It was enough. Later that night, the lights dimmed and the center emptied. Calvin and Elena sat on the front steps of the porch. The violet ribbon was tied neatly and placed beside them like a bookmark in a chapter just closed. "You did it," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "We did. I have something for you." She looked up as he reached into his pocket and handed her a small folded sheet of paper. It was yellowed, edges soft. Her name was written on it, in Sam's handwriting. She unfolded it slowly, hands trembling. "Eleanor, if you're reading this, it means you've found your voice. I always knew you would. I just wish I could have been there when you used it. Remember, love isn't a favor. It's a promise to see someone every day and still choose them. I choose you." Elena pressed the note to her chest. Her breath caught somewhere between a sob and a smile. "I never knew he wrote this," she whispered. "I found it tucked in an old church ledger," Calvin said. "He must have left it behind the year he passed. I wanted to give it to you when it mattered most." She closed her eyes. It mattered now, more than ever. The next morning arrived with soft sunlight spilling through linen curtains and the faint hum of possibility in the air. Elena sat at the kitchen table, Sam's letter still folded in front of her like a piece of her past had come home. She hadn't moved it since last night. Every word was still echoing through her, the way he'd signed it, the way he said, "I choose you," like it wasn't a question but a birthright. She traced the edge of the paper, then looked up to see Calvin standing in the doorway, holding 2 steaming mugs. "Still reading it in your head?" he asked gently. "Over and over," she said, accepting the mug. "I don't know how he always knew what I needed before I did." "That's love," Calvin said, sitting down. "It doesn't wait for you to prove yourself." She smiled, eyes misty. "I've spent so much time trying to earn space that was never mine to begin with. Sam just gave it freely. You're doing the same now," he said. "Every girl that walks into that center, you're giving them what he gave you." The truth of it landed quietly, like the click of a door finally unlocking. Calvin reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Elena's breath caught. "I know this might seem sudden," he said, "but I've been carrying this around for a while, not as a question, as a promise." She looked at him, frozen. "I don't want to rush you," he continued. "I don't need a date or a timeline. I just want to say, when you're ready, I'll be here. Not as a chapter, as the whole book, if you want it." Elena opened the box slowly. Inside was a simple gold band, elegant and quiet, like everything he ever did. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "I can't say yes yet." "I know," he replied. "That's why I didn't ask." She leaned forward, pressing her forehead gently to his. "Thank you for not needing me to be sure today. You've been sure every day you showed up. I can wait for the words." Later that afternoon, Eleanor walked through the center with Maya, reviewing updates. The reading room now had bookshelves built from reclaimed wood, soft lighting, and framed quotes from women who had turned pain into power. Maya stopped in front of one of the quotes. "This one sounds like something you'd say." Elena read it aloud. She didn't need a rescue. She needed a reason to stay. Maya smiled. "That's you." They reached the back room, which would be used for workshops and private counseling. Evelyn was already there, setting up a small table with 2 chairs and a tea tray. "I thought we could call this the listening room," she said, without turning. "Every girl who walks in here deserves someone to just listen." Eleanor stepped closer. "That's perfect." As they walked back toward the main entrance, a soft knock echoed from the door. Eleanor opened it. And there she was, Lila, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her eyes darting with uncertainty. Her voice barely lifted above a whisper. "Hi." Eleanor's breath caught. "Hey, I didn't come with Margaret. I came alone. I had to see it." Eleanor stepped aside. "Come in." Lila entered slowly, taking in the space. The clean lines, the warm tones, the details that whispered rather than shouted. She stopped in front of a framed photo of Sam, displayed on a small table near the entrance. "I used to think he loved you more than us," Lila said quietly. Elena didn't move. "He didn't love more. He just loved differently." Lila looked down. "I was jealous of that. Of how you made him softer, how he saw you." Elena turned toward her. "You could have seen me too." Lila's chin trembled. "I know." They stood in silence, the air thick with years of missed moments. Then Lila said, "I'm sorry." Elena blinked slowly, the words unexpected. "Sincere. I was just trying to hold on to something, a version of our family that made sense to me. But I think I held it so tight I squeezed the truth right out of it." Eleanor stepped forward. "You're welcome here, always, but only if you're ready to show up fully. No pretending, no looking past me." Lila nodded, tears brimming. "I want to try." They embraced, not like sisters with shared history, but like women trying to write a better ending than the one they were handed. That night, Elena sat on the porch, her legs curled beneath her, a notebook in her lap. Calvin joined her with 2 slices of pie. "How was today?" he asked, handing her a plate. "Unexpected," she said, smiling. "Lila came, and she apologized." He sat beside her. "You okay?" "I think I'm better than okay." He watched her, eyes warm. "Still thinking about the ring?" "Every minute." He chuckled. "No rush." "It's not going anywhere." She reached over, took his hand. "I'm not either," she said. They sat in the hush of evening, the marsh humming with life, the sky painted with gold and lavender. For the first time, there was no ache in her chest, no tension in her breath, just peace. And the quiet, certain beginning of forever. Autumn settled in slowly, brushing golden hues across the marsh and tucking a crispness into the air that made mornings quieter, more reflective. At the community center, cinnamon candles burned low on window ledges, and a new group of girls had just begun orientation for the program. Elena stood in the common room, clipboard in hand, watching as 2 young women carefully unpacked their donated bedding into the shared dorm space. "Welcome to your space," she said with a warm smile. "It's yours now. No conditions, just respect, for yourself and for each other." One of the girls, maybe 17, looked up with cautious eyes. "And we get to stay here?" "For as long as you need to get your feet on solid ground." The girl nodded slowly, as if she didn't yet believe the floor wouldn't disappear beneath her again. Elena understood that look. By noon, she'd moved to her tiny office in the back, sipping lukewarm coffee and reviewing next month's workshop calendar. She was halfway through highlighting Maya's financial literacy session when Evelyn appeared in the doorway. "You've got a visitor." Elena looked up. "I wasn't expecting anyone." "I don't think it's someone who cares about schedules." She rose, unsure, and stepped into the hallway. At the far end, standing with hands clasped tightly around her purse strap, was Margaret Monroe. She wore a charcoal grey coat, her lips painted in her usual shade of rose, her expression unreadable, but not sharp. Eleanor took a slow breath and walked toward her. "Margaret." "Elena." A pause. "This place is different than I imagined." In a good way. In a real way, Margaret said, her voice quiet. May I sit? Eleanor nodded and led her into the small corner room that doubled as a private meeting space. The windows were open. The air smelled of rain and wood polish. They sat opposite each other, the space between them tense but not hostile. Elena waited. I didn't come to argue, Margaret said, setting her purse gently on her lap. I came because I've been thinking about things I said, things I didn't say. Elena folded her hands in her lap. Go on. You always assumed I didn't love you, Margaret continued, her eyes fixed on the window. And maybe I didn't in the way you needed. I don't know that I was capable of it. That's honest, Eleanor said, her voice calm. I loved Sam, but I didn't understand how he could give so much of his heart to a child that wasn't his. Eleanor swallowed. And I was the reminder of that. Margaret's lips tightened. Maybe, or maybe I was the reminder of what I couldn't be. The room grew still, the kind of stillness that asks to be listened to. I watched you walk away, Margaret said, voice low. I expected you to stumble, but you didn't. You built something that matters. I didn't build it to prove you wrong, Eleanor replied. I built it because I finally stopped trying to prove anything at all. Margaret nodded slowly. I don't know if I deserve forgiveness. I'm not sure forgiveness is what I'm offering. Margaret looked at her then, really looked at her. Then what is this? Elena took a deep breath. This is me seeing you, as a woman who did what she could, and me choosing to move forward anyway. Margaret's throat bobbed. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small velvet-covered journal. This was Sam's. I found it a few weeks ago, tucked behind the old cedar chest. I wasn't going to read it, but I did. Eleanor stared at the book, her breath caught. There's a page I think you should have, Margaret said, passing it to her. Elena opened the journal slowly, flipping past pages filled with Sam's handwriting, steady, full of pauses like he thought carefully before each word. Then she found it. July 14th. Elena asked me today why the violets in the back garden keep growing, even when I forget to water them. I told her some things don't grow because they're cared for. They grow because they're determined to. She looked at me and said, maybe I'm like that. I believe her. Eleanor blinked fast, her fingers tightening around the journal. He knew, she whispered. He always knew, Margaret replied. And maybe, deep down, I did too. I just didn't know how to say it. They sat in silence, the weight of what could have been lingering, but no longer heavy. When Margaret finally stood, she didn't reach for a hug. She didn't ask for a second chance. I'm glad he had you, she said. And I'm glad you found you. Elena walked her to the door, her voice soft. I hope you do the same. Margaret paused. I'm learning. Even now. She left quietly. No dramatic ending, no grand gestures. Just a door opening and closing with the hush of understanding behind it. That evening, Elena returned home to find Calvin in the workshop, sanding a frame for one of the new benches. He looked up as she approached. You okay? She nodded, holding up the journal. She brought me this. He set his tools down and walked over, brushing sawdust from his hands. What's in it? Proof that he saw me, even when I couldn't see myself. She leaned into him, pressing the journal to her chest. And now, she whispered, I think it's time I stopped looking backward. Calvin kissed her forehead gently. Then let's build everything forward. And in that moment, framed by twilight and the scent of cedar, Elena understood that healing didn't always come with thunder or tears. Sometimes it arrived with the simple sound of a door left open. Just enough. The sky was overcast the morning Elena received the invitation. It arrived tucked into a plain envelope, slipped beneath the door of the community center, with no return name, no dramatic flair. Just her name, in careful handwriting, and a single, folded card inside. You are cordially invited to the annual Monroe Family Legacy Brunch, honoring Sam Monroe's community service and his enduring impact on the youth of Savannah. At the bottom, printed in faint gold, Heather Monroe, event chair. Eleanor stood still in the doorway, the card trembling just slightly in her hands. She hadn't stepped foot into anything tied to the Monroe name since Margaret's quiet visit 2 weeks ago. Not officially, not publicly, and not as someone being honored. Maya entered behind her, coffee in one hand, tote bag in the other. She noticed Elena's face and stopped. "What's wrong?" Elena handed her the card. Maya read it slowly. "Whoa. My name's on the guest list," Elena murmured. Maya looked up. "And not as a caterer." Elena gave a small laugh, but it faded quickly. "It feels strange, like they're reaching out, but with gloves on." "You gonna go?" "I don't know." That night, Elena sat with Calvin on the porch, her fingers fidgeting with the invitation while the crickets sang around them. "I'm trying to figure out if I want closure, or if I already have it." Calvin took a slow sip of tea. "Maybe it's not about what you want. Maybe it's about what you're willing to offer, even if nothing changes." She looked at him. "You think I should go? I think you've already built something stronger than legacy. But if showing up helps someone else see that, you should be seen." Eleanor nodded slowly, her fingers curling around the card like it meant something heavier than paper should. The next Sunday, she stood at the edge of the Monroe estate lawn again. It felt smaller than she remembered, not in size but in weight. The white columns no longer loomed. The garden paths weren't nearly as impressive. She adjusted the sash of her simple blue dress and walked in with her head high, alone. The event was polished, soft piano music, laughter in curated tones, finger sandwiches stacked like sculpture. Heather stood near the fountain in a tailored green dress, directing servers and greeting guests with ease. When she saw Elena, something in her smile faltered. But she didn't hide it. She approached with a glass of sparkling cider and extended it with both hands. "I didn't think you'd come." "I wasn't sure I would." Heather glanced around. "Everyone's asking about you." "Not me, not Mother, you." "I didn't come for attention." "No," Heather said. "But it's following you anyway." They stood there in silence for a beat. "I put Sam's name on the event," Heather added quietly, "because he deserved to be remembered for what he gave, not just to us. To you, to everyone." Eleanor's throat tightened. "Thank you for that." Heather looked down. "I spent so long trying to be the reflection of the family. You were just the light. We didn't know what to do with that." "I was just trying to exist," Eleanor said gently. Heather gave a short, honest breath. "Well, you did more than that. You outgrew us." Eleanor offered a soft smile. "I didn't outgrow. I just grew in a direction you didn't see coming." Later, as guests began to sit beneath the canopy for the formal remarks, Eleanor found herself gently ushered toward the front row. An extra seat had been placed beside the podium, marked with a handwritten card. Elena Grace, honoring guest. Margaret appeared beside her as the guests quieted. No fanfare, just presence. "I didn't write the invitation," Margaret said softly, "but you let it happen. I didn't fight it, she corrected. I'm learning, remember? Eleanor nodded. I see that. Heather stepped up to the microphone, her voice clear, rehearsed. Today, we honor not only the name of our father, but the spirit of community he carried. And part of that spirit lives on in someone who taught me more through her absence than I ever learned in her presence. Elena Grace, would you say a few words? Elena stood slowly. She hadn't planned to speak, but her feet moved anyway, steady beneath her. At the podium, she took a breath, then let the card in her hand fall back into her pocket. I didn't grow up in this family the way most daughters do, she began. I grew up learning how to navigate the space between gratitude and erasure, between being tolerated and being truly known. The audience was quiet, leaning in. But I had Sam, she continued. He saw me. He gave me violets when I felt invisible. He listened when I didn't know how to speak, and today I carry him in the work I do. The girls we help at the foundation, they are echoes of a life he helped build. She paused. Legacy isn't about bloodlines or brunch invitations. It's about who we choose to remember, and why. I remember Sam not because he raised me, but because he let me rise. A few quiet gasps moved through the crowd. Elena stepped back from the microphone, nodded once to Heather, and returned to her seat. Margaret turned to her. That was brave. No, Elena said gently. That was free. And in that moment, she realized something profound. She hadn't returned to reclaim anything. She'd come back to release it. And in doing so, she'd stepped into something stronger than legacy. She'd stepped into her own name, her own truth. And this time, it wasn't anyone else's to write. The old oak tree near the back of the Monroe Cemetery stood just as it always had, tall, still, and grounded in earth, rich with memory. Elena stood beneath it in a soft gray coat, the sky above her brushed with early winter haze. In her hands was a wooden chair, small, handmade, beautifully imperfect. Calvin had built it from leftover cedar planks from the foundation, carved Sam's name across the back in careful strokes. On the seat, a single wild violet rested quietly. She placed the chair beside the headstone, fingers lingering on the backrest as the wind moved gently around her. No one else was there. She hadn't told Margaret, or Heather, or Lila. This goodbye didn't need an audience. I kept waiting to feel like this part of me would disappear, she whispered, kneeling beside the grave. But you've been here the whole time. She pulled the letter from her coat pocket, creased at the folds, ink slightly faded from how many times she'd read it. You wrote to me before I ever spoke up. You believed I would find my voice, and I did. I just wish you could have seen it happen. She closed her eyes for a moment, the silence around her no longer heavy, just full. I named the foundation after you. Not to make people remember you, but to remind them why someone like me could rise. You made space for me in a world that didn't. She stood slowly, brushing her hands along her coat. I'm going to be okay now. And I think you would have liked him, Calvin. You two would have shared long conversations about peace and planks of wood, probably without saying much at all. A quiet smile touched her lips. I love you, Sam. Thank you for planting me. She turned and walked back down the gravel path, the wind lifting the ends of her coat, the sound of the trees following her like a hymn. Back at the center, the annual community gathering was in full motion. Laughter drifted from the workshop rooms, where past and current residents had gathered to celebrate the season. The halls were decorated with pine garlands and paper stars the girls had made. Maya was at the hot cocoa table, laughing with two younger residents as Evelyn gently scolded someone for using too much cinnamon. Calvin stood near the front window, his shirt sleeves rolled, his arm resting on the back of one of the new porch benches. When he saw Eleanor walk in, his face softened. "You made it back." She walked toward him, cheeks rosy. "I needed to close a door." He pulled her into an easy hug. "You look lighter." "I feel like myself." Not a version, not a role, just me. He stepped back slightly, pulling something from his jacket pocket, a ring box. "I brought this again," he said, smiling gently. "No pressure. Just, I didn't want to leave it in my drawer tonight." She looked down at the box, then back up at him. "Let's do it," she said, voice steady. "Let's build the rest of it together." His brows lifted. "You sure?" "I'm more than sure," she said. "I'm ready." He opened the box, slipped the ring on her finger. Simple gold. Just like the first promise he made. No grand declarations, just steady presence. The room around them didn't cheer. There were no flashing cameras, just Evelyn catching the moment from the corner and giving a teary-eyed nod. Later that night, as the gathering wound down and the last guests left with hugs and warm pastries wrapped in napkins, Eleanor sat by the fire in the reading room. One of the new girls, maybe 15, approached her quietly. "Miss Elena?" Elena turned. "Yes, sweetheart." The girl held out a folded piece of paper. "We all wrote what we're thankful for." "This one's mine." Elena unfolded the note. The handwriting was uneven, the words simple. "I'm thankful for a place that lets me breathe without asking me to shrink." Elena's eyes blurred. She knelt down, held the girl gently. "That's all I ever wanted too." Outside, the porch lights flickered on, casting soft glows across the steps. Calvin stood there waiting, a blanket folded over one arm, 2 mugs of tea in the other. Elena joined him, and they sat together on the bench he'd built, wrapped in quiet. "You ever think we got here by accident?" she asked. "No," he said, brushing her hand. "I think you were meant to be found." She leaned into him. "I wasn't rescued, you know." "I know," he whispered. "You rescued yourself." And beneath the stars, with a house full of laughter behind her, and the past no longer holding her voice hostage, Eleanor Grace closed her eyes, and finally rested in the home she built. If you enjoyed this video, comment 1 to let me know. If not, comment 2. Your thought mattered to me either way. Eleanor stood in the center of the newly transformed space, no longer forgotten, no longer empty. The wood had been polished. Cushions now lined the pews. A wall of photographs stretched along the back corner, portraits of patients, caregivers, and quiet moments of healing. At the front, a plaque had been installed, modest but strong. The Walter Jameson Reflection Room, for those who gave care and those who received it. Eleanor reached out and traced her fingers along the engraved words. The room smelled of lavender and fresh wood polish. Outside, volunteers were stringing up lights for the evening ceremony. It was opening day. Graham appeared behind her, holding 2 mugs of tea. "They're expecting you in 10 minutes, he said, offering one. "I needed a minute with him," she replied, nodding toward the plaque. Graham followed her gaze and smiled. "He'd have been proud of you." "He already was," she said softly. "He just never said it like this." They sipped their tea in silence, both looking around the room that felt so different now from the first time they'd stepped into it together. "Are you ready?" Graham asked. Eleanor gave a slow nod. "I think I am. But you go first." He arched a brow. "Me? You're the CEO." You're the soul of the hospital." She gave him a look. "Fine," he said, smiling. "We'll walk in together." They moved through the garden path that led to the courtyard, where the event had already begun. Nurses, board members, former patients, donors, and volunteers filled the seats. There was a stage, modest and floral, set up under the oaks. Tammy stood near the front, clipboard in hand, wearing lipstick and a fire in her eyes. She saw Elena and waved her forward. "You better be ready, girl. They brought news crews." Elena laughed. "Of course they did. You've got 5 minutes to get your speech face on." As Tammy walked off, Kayla came bounding over with a wide grin. "I printed your speech just in case you freeze." "Thank you," Elena said, taking the folded pages. "But I'm not using it." Kayla blinked. "What?" "I'm speaking from memory." "And heart." Kayla gave a theatrical gasp. "You've become dangerous." Elena turned toward the stage. "Let's hope so." The murmurs in the audience hushed as Graham stepped up to the microphone first. He welcomed the crowd with grace and a voice that sounded warmer than usual. He spoke of legacy, of the quiet strength of caregivers, of Walter, and of change. Then he stepped back, and Elena took his place. For a second, all she could hear was her own breath. Then she looked out across the sea of faces, some familiar, many not, and let the words come. "I'm not here today as someone who had a perfect plan," she began. "I didn't dream of a title, or a podium, or even a plaque with my words on it. I dreamed of small things,